changing perceptions, challenges and opportunities around assistive technology for people with disabilities during the pandemic.
So first of all, good day and welcome everyone. My name is Tiziana Oliva and I lead on the global work of Leonard Cheshire. So thank you very much for joining us today, and we hope you'll find the session interesting and engaging. So just the format of the event will be a fireside conversation for 45 minutes, and then we'll leave about 10-15 minutes for questions and answers. Please do post your questions at any time in the chat bar, and we'll pick out what we can if we don't manage to respond to all the questions during the event, the remaining questions by email. Can I ask again, please, that everybody mutes themselves? Thank you. So I wanted to let you know that the event will be recorded and the link will be
Tiziana, sorry, we can't hear you.
Yeah.
Oh dear. Can you hear me now?
Yeah.
Yes.
Have you heard anything so far?
Yes, it's just the last
Yes,
part.
we just dropped the last sentence.
So we're very happy to have captioning provided by Brittany from Caption First today, and sign language interpretation provided by Lisa Zeviar and Gerdinan Hagedar. So the event today is on changing perceptions, challenges and opportunities around assistive technology for people with disabilities during the pandemic. We will specifically look at the way technology supports people with disabilities to upskill and engage in employment, why we must guide technological development so progress on accessibility does not slow down or roll back, and how enhanced technology can enable an ongoing and inclusive response to COVID-19 and influence the post-pandemic recovery to ensure the global Build Back Better agenda is fully inclusive. So we have two outstanding speakers debaters today with us. So Charlotte McClain-Nhlapo is the Global Disability Advisor for the World Bank Group, where she focuses on disability inclusive development under its twin goals to end poverty and promote shared prosperity. In 2011, as a well-respected human rights lawyer in disability and child rights advocate, she was appointed by President Obama to lead US work on disability inclusive development. She worked as Senior Operation Officer at the bank in the East Asia, Pacific and Africa regions. And then here, she was appointed by President Nelson Mandela as a commissioner to the Human Rights Commission. Sorry, can I ask again participants to please mute yourself? Thank you. Steve Tyler is the Leonard Cheshire Director of Assistive Technology, where he has responsibility for policy support and implementation of assistive technology services and innovation inside and outside the organization. He has a history of innovating sustainable and life-changing products in the accessibility arena, from leading the team that developed groundbreaking speech that led to the voice of Alexa, to the accessible TV, mobile payment system, and online and app accessibility. He collaborates with key players in the technology market as part of the Google Accessibility Strategy Board, the Microsoft Accessibility Steering Group, and as a program lead for the annual Enabling Summit. So I will now pass it on to Charlotte and Steve, and I will be back when we have the question and answers. Over to you. Thank you.
Hi, everybody. And just to remind you to keep yourselves on mute unless you're Charlotte. What we wanted to do today is have a bit of a discussion around some of the issues and challenges, opportunities around technology and where it's going, the kind of opportunities that people with disabilities today have. And I guess the first topic of conversation we've identified is around tech being an enabler in the employment arena. You know, I say this on a regular basis. I use phrases like technology is a great leveler. And I wanted to first open the conversation up by talking to Charlotte about that and her experience, perhaps sharing a bit of experience around what that really means. Technology acting as a leveler in the employment space for people with disabilities. Charlotte, where would you start with that?
Well, first of all, Steve, it's just fantastic to be able to be in dialogue with you on such an important issue. And just to say that technology is indeed creating opportunities. It's certainly paving new ways. It's altering and adapting jobs. We certainly see it as something that's increasing productivity. And I think it's really important in terms of how it's impacting the delivery of public services. I think it's quite useful to think about it from the prism of children and to think about kids that are in school today will work in jobs that adults that do not exist for adults today. So it's interesting to think about how technology will advance and where we will be. I think it's also worth just pointing out that technology, and in particular digital technology, is changing the future of work. Today, it directly impacts on how we obtain our skills, how we build our skills. It has a bearing on how we search for work, how we do our work. It is essential in terms of our interaction with our coworkers and colleagues. And it's also very important in terms of the interface with our clients. And so I think this begins to show us that, you know, technology really can be an enabler. It's also changing how entrepreneurs operate. And today we're seeing it as an enabler, particularly for those who are self-employed, for freelancers, for those that are working in the gig economy, who might be working to raise capital and to sell their services online. But I do want to say, Steve, that another important advancement in technology today is that it offers multiple uses of voice, of text, of touch and gestures to receive and create and communicate content. So in many ways, I think technology has been quite revolutionary for persons with disabilities, with the caveat that it has been an enabler for those who have access to it. And so this pivot to accessible technology, I think, has really been useful for, again, those persons with disabilities that have access to it, to ensure more flexibility, to enable choice, and to enable agency and get people with disabilities to really be more engaged in their work. It's allowed for better innovation with their peers. And I think it also has enabled people to be present in their workspaces by using technology. So I think it's fair to say that while technology is an enabler, there are also concerns around the lack of access to inclusive and affordable and accessible technology. And in many ways, if we do not tackle that now, that can become a new dominant barrier to the economic inclusion for persons with disabilities, whether it's in education, whether it's employment, and whether it's just in people's daily lives. What do you think, Steve?
I would entirely agree with that. I guess when I think about this particular part of the subject, I go to where you went at the beginning, which was, I think, something in the order of 60% of jobs that will be available to primary school children are yet to be invented. And that figure is, on one level, frightening, on another, potentially gives us a lot of opportunity. The other is, I kind of just think about some very big changes over the past 8 to 10 years. for people with disabilities, and I include myself in that, of course, which have changed the way I live and work in every sense. You know, I have access to books on the day of publishing from Amazon through Kindle or through some specialist services. And that's been brought about by new electronic standards and standardization around EPUB and all of those things. Accessibility guidance, if people follow it, around the way apps are developed. So whether it's transport or travel to work or buying tickets for trains journeys, or right through to, you know, HR systems and all the rest of it, engaging in social media, absolutely enormous. And then by the same token, I suppose I worry too. I worry about social profiling. So the power on the one level of people with disabilities to engage in social media, to be part and parcel of that whole process, to begin to produce rather than simply be consumers of content. So fantastic. We also, though, have evidence that some employers are beginning to trawl social media for all kinds of things, including people with disabilities. So before you get into the recruitment process, that potentially you could be screened out. And the reason I think that's important to put out there is we have very broad evidence still, and we need to do some more work to understand better about this. But if I just use UK numbers for a second, supposedly one of the more developed countries in the world and all the rest of it. But I think there are two numbers that stick in my mind that tell a story in themselves. One is in a survey, when recruiting managers were asked, all things being equal, would you recruit a person with a disability? 23% of them, and these 23% would actually admit to this, said no. And the other number is 76%. 76% of people that lose their job, lose their job involuntarily, do so as a result either of a long-term condition or a disability. So I think there's this really major piece of work that accompanies the development of technology that we're seeing, you know, in understanding disability and the cultural acceptance of it. What do you think of that?
No, I couldn't agree more. And I mean, in many ways, I think what we're both saying is that it's a bit of a double-edged sword, right?
Right. And it kind of, I suppose, neatly leads into the importance of guiding the development of technology, you know, building more accessibility wins than exist at the moment, but certainly maintaining the ones we've got. I'm very conscious that, you know, I was around in the 90s and early 2000s when, and since then, when the battle has been continually on to maintain access to graphical user interfaces, touchscreen devices, and so on. And I'm also very conscious that children coming through today have these accessibility fixes already. Their expectation is different. The effect, though, sometimes is that it's very difficult to get people to engage in this whole field in the younger generation and to really take it seriously. What do you think about the maintenance of the accessibility of technology more generally?
So, I mean, I think it's a really important issue. And I think, as you point out, there are barriers to technical adoption that exist globally. And these include limited specialist knowledge in matching needs with technology. It also includes financial and knowledge barriers in acquiring appropriate technology. It also presents barriers in terms of after delivery support and training, and developing resources that allow for assessment, exploration, adoption through supporting suppliers, looking at training providers, and very importantly, building capacity of local organizations. And that is a particularly important point because it is essential in order to implement accessible technology solutions, right? Ensuring that organizations are part of advancing the technical adoption. But then I think it's also really important that governments are engaged in this process and that governments recognize their responsibility and take a very critical role in making sure that accessible technologies are available, affordable, and accessible. So, I mean, I think it's absolutely fundamental, and we need to remember that that the advances in technologies in and of themselves are insufficient, right, to bridge the gap to economic inclusion for persons with disabilities. So we can't just imagine that technology will change people's economic status. We also know that not all advancements are inclusive, or for that matter, responsive to the needs and the concerns of persons with disabilities. So I think harnessing technology in a way that ensures equity, that addresses issues around access, affordability, and again, the point around appropriateness for persons with disabilities really will require a systems approach. And I do want to underscore the importance of a systems approach. Can I please ask people to mute? There's a lot of background noise coming in. Thank you. So we know that there's a very wide range of technology that can be applied as assistive technologies. And Steve, you know better than me what these are. I mean, the range is very wide, but very importantly, and I do want to emphasize this point because it's particularly relevant for the countries in which we work, for us to think about both high-tech as well as low-tech products. And then we can look at products that are either products that are physical or standalone. But I really think the issue around high-tech and low-tech products is important. I also wanted to just flag, Steve, if I may, the issue around, you were talking about maintaining, the maintenance of this. I think we also need to be beyond just in a mode of maintaining. I think we need to be vigilant. We need to be vigilant and mindful of how certain technologies, and more the new types of technologies like artificial intelligence, which have a great potential for disruptive progress, can unintentionally present some biases and can even create further forms of exclusion for persons with disabilities. And let me just share an example with you. So I worked on a bank project in West Africa that was looking at developing ID systems. And of course, ID systems are really important. Everybody has a right to an identification. And as you know, many of the ID systems today and services of those have gone digital. And while this certainly provides an opportunity to increase accessibility, it also runs the risk that exclusionary technologies will deepen the divide for persons with disabilities. And more specifically, what we learned during our consultations for this project was that some of the technologies that were being used were in fact excluding persons with disabilities. So there was there was recognition software that, for example, was not recognizing the shape of hands or faces. There were issues around how to capture fingerprints for persons who may not have fingers. And so the whole issue around biometrics became quite a challenge. There were issues around the use of various software that look at iris recognition. So just to say, you know, again, the technology, yes, absolutely, but we need to make sure that persons with disabilities and issues related to accessibility are built into any type of technology going forward.
I agree, and I think I suppose I tend to think about the cost of technology, obviously critical. That theoretically, at least, the cost of technology is coming down, but the question quite often becomes, although the technology exists, is it all packaged up in the right way? Is it in the same box? And is it at an appropriate price? There are mainstream products that if you go far enough back in the chain of development, you find what the real costs and potential price is of those technologies. So if I give you an example, things like smartphones, which really have an enormous amount of power today, an outrageous, I've forgotten what the exact figure is, I believe it's something like 60 times, in your, most of us carry around a product in our pockets today that has the power of 60 times of what NASA had at its disposal in 1969. I mean, that's kind of outrageous when you think about what that really means. Smartphones really have revolutionized the world with regard to the kind of accessibility that they have on board, the kind of accessibility or devices you can plug into them, and because you can control devices and environment and so on around you. I would say there are sort of two things about that really bug me, and I so wish, you know, we need to do something about it. The first is the cost, and if you track back far enough down the chain, you find that products that are unbranded, that look remarkably like a Samsung Galaxy but aren't, ex-factory price costs something like $8.50, and that's just for one. So imagine what could happen if we commissioned, you know, 100,000. The second thing to say is, I suppose strategically, you know, I've been one of the advocates that argue and have argued for a long time and have brought about in good measure mainstream accessibility solutions. So things that everyday people use, which have accessibility built in, and that's wonderful. But it also causes complexity, because now you have a really quite diverse universe. If you were to ask most specialist assessors, educators, and so on, you know, what combination of products using the latest connectivity and smart home technology, etc., can you see that that's really important for people with disabilities? Of course, most people would say, yes, I can see that. If you were then to say, okay, what would you use in this particular circumstance for this particular individual? The knowledge is very slim around that. But people find it very difficult to keep up to date. There are not enough resources out there at the moment that support people in making decisions around that. And of course, because disabled people themselves don't know the questions to ask, because they don't know what's even possible a lot of the time. So you're in this horrible catch-22. And I think we need to unify as disabled people's organizations around longer term strategies. What is important to us? What do we need to deliver on? For example, smartphone stuff, but it could be many different things. I could think of endless things we could do. But secondly, that skill set around and resources around finding your way through this enormous choice that we have now of technological and people fixes.
So Steve, if I may come in and just point out something or emphasize something that you mentioned around who has access. You were talking about it in the context of smartphones, but I think just more broadly in the context of technology, we also need to think about what this means for women. So we know that access is also gendered. And I just want to put that out there. But I think to your second point, it's really important for us to know what we need to know in order to advocate for more accessible technologies. And I want to just share with you what I think are some possible building blocks, and then get your sense on if you think I'm going in the right direction. So I think if we're really, as organizations of persons with disabilities, development workers, serious about thinking about building an assistive technology ecosystem, we need to make sure that we have some of the following building blocks in place. One is to address the issue around government policies and regulations and standards. And therein bake in the notion of accessibility and non-discrimination, and bake it into the requirements around technology availability. I then think we need to look at the whole landscape in relation to laws and policies that exist on accessibility and electronic and digital devices. And then I think a very important piece that we certainly have been thinking about is the pacing problem. And that is by creating disruptive technologies that require just-in-time policies that are both adaptive and modifiable. And then I think the other piece that we need to be very conscious of when we advocate and try to influence for assistive technologies is really getting a good sense of the underlying infrastructure and understanding issues related to internet connectivity. And that has been a particular important issue given COVID-19. And then I think the other area that we need to be thinking about and making a lot stronger arguments around is the skilling up of multiple actors. And then I think my last building block would be around looking at the diversity of financial resources and how we can really support the acquisition of technology for work, how we look at the possibility of government subsidies, how we think about it in the context of rehab systems, in terms of education systems. So really looking at the diversity of financial resources, I think is really important. And for me, if we begin to understand these areas, then we are working towards an ecosystem that is more comprehensive and ultimately more inclusive. What do you think?
You wouldn't expect me to say anything other than that I agree with what you've said, but I want to pick one thing up because I think that, and we will get to the elephant in the room, of course, which is COVID, which you can't possibly have a conference or a discussion without talking about COVID at the moment. But I just want to pick up the internet connectivity element for a second, because I think that really is a back-end critical element. We're beginning in the UK, certainly, to think about internet as being as important as a public utility. Government services require more and more internet access or web access or app access to utilize government services. But some of the things we're doing as part of the I2I project, or we're attempting to do there, some of the things more broadly that Leonard Cheshire is interested in, like developing mechanisms that assist people in matching skill sets with job opportunities, or answering the question, what skills do you need in order to be able to apply for jobs? Or using artificial intelligence, for example, to help with some of that matching challenge, matching people to technology. All of these things are doable, but there is this back-end requirement around internet access and connectivity. I suppose it's critical in so many ways, but for people with disabilities, I think it's an enormous thing, especially in the less connected world. Where do you think, what buttons do we need to press to bring some of this to life in a bit more of a focused way for some of the mainstream technologists? And would you agree with that connectivity challenge as being a really critical part?
Oh, I would absolutely agree. I mean, I think looking at the affordability of internet is a real issue, and it's.
Sorry, Charlotte, your mic's just on mute.
Hi, can you hear me now?
Yeah.
Sorry, Steve, I don't know what happened there.
That's all right. You went on mute temporarily.
No, I was just saying that I couldn't agree with you more. And as you point out, persons with disabilities just generally have low access to internet, and that has often to do with, the household incomes, which are directly related to connectivity. But I think, looking at internet affordability is really, really important. And we see that it's become a huge issue and a significant barrier, particularly in sub-Saharan Africa and South Asia. That said, there are countries in both those regions that have begun to address the issue around cost. So for example, Rwanda stands out as an outlier where the city of Kigali has internet connectivity throughout the entire city. So there are some good examples of having internet that is a lot more accessible and affordable. But I do think that this is really kind of the first port of call for us if we are to really advance digital technology and use the internet to advance the future of work.
So, well, let's maybe touch on COVID. And it's one of those things that causes us all to worry in different ways. I think partly it's not least to do with our feeling of lack of control, not knowing when or if it's going to end, not knowing what's around the corner, not really being clear whether we understand or don't understand it. But one thing is for sure, it's focused our attention on the kinds of things that technology can do for us as part of our COVID response. Not least keeping in touch. In fact, you just have to do a simple thought experiment, I guess. Imagine if we had COVID hit us 20 years ago and how different the world would be. There wouldn't be, well, we wouldn't be able to have this conversation in the way we're having it. We wouldn't be able to think about kind of things that we are trying to do at Leonard Cheshire, for example, linking people up to do social stuff, employment at home, and how this business of technology being a great leveler, if you've got the right accessibility kit, not only does disability become less of an issue, but actually you can do the same or more as everybody else. So it's begun to really make us think about the power of technology. It, of course, also has shown up the astonishing shortcomings in some of this technology and has made people I suppose, recognize how important the social interaction is with others, and closeness and humanity, that being face to face with someone or with other people, what that brings.
Yeah.
What's your take on the current climate, especially with regard to what we've learned through COVID and the effects of COVID?
Yeah. So, I mean, again, I agree with you. And I was just thinking, when you were saying what would it look like 20 years ago, we probably would be sending faxes to each other, which would not have been the best format to have this kind of a conversation. So, I mean, I think it's pretty clear that COVID has really accelerated the pace of innovation and the impact of technology in every aspect of our lives. So it's really not just about work now, it's about part of our daily lives. And therefore, I think we need to use this, to seize this as an opportunity to influence the global agenda to build back better. But I think that we should be unpacking what we mean by building back better. I think we need to be emphasizing and insisting on the building back better being greener and being more inclusive. And when we say more inclusive, we then need to be more specific about what that means. And that within that, we're talking about addressing the cost factor, the access factor, the appropriateness, and not just keep it as that broad, build back better inclusively, but being very deliberate about what that means and spelling it out. I think there's clearly been a huge role that technology has played as an enabler during COVID-19. But again, we know that for many people, it hasn't been available. And so I think where we are, Steve, right now as the global development community is that we're very much still in learning mode in relation to the pandemic. And I think, quite honestly, we're still trying to figure out the role that technology has played in response to the pandemic. And then I think beyond just the pandemic itself to the secondary pandemic that we find ourselves, or the secondary crisis that we find ourselves in, and that's the economic downturn. And so, I think the lessons that we're learning are a bit mixed. Some are good and some are not so good. But we know that the need for social isolation and physical distancing really caused all of us that could to shift onto online systems. And that's been good because it's enabled us to have this call. It's enabled some learners to continue learning. Telehealth has become a really big thing, and lots of people are using telehealth. It's certainly been important for people who can access rehabilitation services and therapy services online. So, for some part of the population, it's been really, really important. I think it's also interesting that in the employment space, what it's done is it's reinforced the notions around the universal benefits of what the disability community has advocated for years and years and years. And that is to look at issues around the flexibility of schedules, to look at reasonable accommodation, and to look at what we're doing right now, which is remote work.
Yeah.
But I do think, to your second point, what it has also done, COVID that is that it's unearthed some very serious fault lines that have exposed gaps in the fragmentation of services that we need to address as development workers and organizations of persons with disabilities. If we're going to be serious about building back better in a more, building back better and being more resilient and inclusive. And then I think the pandemic has also amplified inequalities of who has access to technology and who doesn't. And so I think, what we've seen is for those that have had access, we've seen people thrive, retain their jobs, and continue to have income generation. But then we know for a lot of people, and certainly for many persons with disabilities, and particularly those living in low and middle income countries, these pre-existing barriers have only been exacerbated. So we really need to go back to something I said earlier on, which is to ensure that technology is available, affordable, adaptable, and accessible. So, I think we need to think about a set of responses that are both short-term, but also looking at some medium and long-term policy responses to addressing the issue around assistive technologies, drawing on the lessons learned from COVID.
I think one of the things you said there, which I sort of picked up on, was around telehealth and telecare and those kind of monitoring technologies that are possible. If you do another thought experiment and think about what might experiencing COVID have been like in 10 or 15 years' time, or put another way, where might we as people who represent the needs of people with disabilities, could we be pushing for? I kind of think of lots of elements in exactly the same way you've articulated, but if I try and bring some of them to life, there are 3D printing technologies which give a whole new possibility around work, the means of production being more local. That idea of being able to create more personalized products, for example, and more specialist, in inverted commas, product, or more bespoke product using those technologies. Or another kind of technology which is still in its infancy but progressing very fast, like brain actuation technology, still out of reach for most people, but it's coming. That whole notion of creating exoskeletons for people with disabilities, or very different wheelchair technologies to the ones we know today, robotics, and how robotics might help us. Were we in the world of robotics already, some of the challenges we've got might feel very, very different. So I think technology, spans far and wide in terms of the types of possibility and opportunity it brings. But I suppose it goes back to the beginning to some degree of our conversation around we as a community needing to steer technology. What is it that we want? When I very first started my career, one of the very common things that businesses would say was, I don't know, you guys are just so confusing, really, disability community. Yes, we recognize there are big numbers and all that, but you all want slightly different things. And anyway, whenever we talk to different groups of you, you tell us you either want competing things or what you say to us somehow doesn't hang together. So go away and sort yourselves out and come back with a joined up agenda. And actually, at the time, I used to think quite a lot of that was an excuse. And I still think at the time quite a lot of that was an excuse. Today, more than ever before, actually, I would say there is a level of importance around moving more closely together and articulating the kind of world we want using technical innovation.
Sorry, just flagging if you could wrap up the conversation so we can pass on to question in a few minutes. Thank you.
Do you want to take that last part, Charlotte, and then we can take.
No, I mean, I think we can go to questions, Steve. I mean, I absolutely agree with you, and I mean, I personally can't even imagine what had this happened 20 years ago, 20 years ahead in the future, what it would look like. Clearly, it would be really, really different. But I do think, to your point around, the development of all these really new and innovative, exciting technologies, it's great that we're seeing all of this happening. But again, I caution, because it's not happening for all persons with disabilities, right? So we're still dealing in many countries, certainly that I work in, where people are struggling to get the basics. Persons with disabilities, people who need wheelchairs are still struggling just to get a wheelchair. So this is all well and good, but I think, there's a level, there are issues around equity here that we need to discuss.
I totally
And
agree.
I think
There's the equity issue economically, as you're describing, and the ability to get hold of some of this stuff. I would also say, bizarrely, that for those people with the most severe types of disability or complex disability, who could potentially benefit the most out of some of the innovations that are potentially there, and I say potentially because the markets become, because of the way the thing operates at the moment, the view tends to be the markets are so relatively small that it becomes very difficult to serve them. And I think there are these two kind of elements there. There's that economic part, and the hope, I guess, that those people with the more complex disabilities, in theory, should have a bigger slice of the pie, when actually, potentially, exactly the opposite is happening.
Agree. And therefore, I think, to the building blocks that I mentioned, I go back to them because I think they're really helpful. And I think that would also help speak to the point that you raised around, the creators feeling that the disability type groups each come with their own ask. If we coalesced around a set of building blocks that really would advance accessible technology, I think would be in our best interest, and engage with policymakers and product producers so that they understand. But to an earlier point that you mentioned, Steve, that I don't want to lose sight of, is also to look at how persons with disabilities themselves become producers and are part of creating products. I think that that's really going to be a game changer.
Tiziana, shall we do questions?
Yes, thank you very much. Thank you both. Very, very interesting, actually. I think that, there were quite a few questions coming in, and thank you everyone for sending them. I think quite a few of them, I think, are around the same core issue, which is the other, sort of the flip side with digital exclusion. And so some questions around, there is still a digital divide and persons with disabilities are disadvantaged. Lack of digital skills for people to enter the employment space. How do we address this situation in low-income countries, for example, of digital divide, and in a manner, who are the key stakeholders really that need to address this? Who do people go to? Digital has a big role to play for inclusion, but essentially it could also exclude people just because persons with disability are excluded to begin with. So I know it's a massive question, but that has come through in different formats all across the conversation. I don't know, Carlos, do you start with your thoughts on that? Charlotte, do you want to start with your thoughts on that?
Oh, sorry, I couldn't hear you, Tiziana. I'm sorry. Could you repeat that, please?
Yeah, there are quite a few questions that are around digital exclusion.
Okay.
Yeah, so and particularly, who are the key stakeholders who can help address that? Yeah.
Okay. Great. So yeah, I think, great question. And again, we could have a whole session on that part. Yeah. I think, to the issue around who are the key stakeholders, as I was saying, I think speaking to the product makers is really important. So speaking to the techies, getting them to understand the importance, but ensuring that within the cohort of people who are developing products, that there are persons with disabilities themselves. And we're beginning to see that. If we look at Silicon Valley, we're seeing a number of people who work there are in fact persons with disabilities. We're seeing in some of the big software companies that there is a deliberate effort.
Can people please mute themselves unless you still
a deliberate effort to reach to employ persons with disabilities, really to ensure that you have that capacity in-house. So I think definitely in terms of, I think, ensuring that you have that you're working with product producers themselves is really important. Then I think another set of key stakeholders are policymakers, and in making sure that policymakers understand the value of ensuring that technology is accessible to all, which then speaks to the issue around the pricing, right, and the cost of internet connectivity. So I think policymakers really are a kingpin in making this work. And then I think there's a whole role for development workers. And here it's both organizations like myself, the World Bank, that I come from, but it's also international donors that are supporting development initiatives across the world to ensure that when we're talking about the importance of digital inclusion, that we're thinking and insisting that we're including persons with disabilities. And then another set of stakeholders, I think, are organizations and persons with disabilities themselves, so the users, and demanding that technologies are more inclusive, and being at the forefront of leading some of those discussions around the importance and the relevance of technology to the lives of persons with disabilities.
Just on that user end, that organizational piece, actually, for me, there are some really, again, to my theme, I suppose, of bringing people together and asking for the same stuff.
Oops, Steve, we lost you. Oh dear. I'm sorry about that. Maybe Charlotte, I will ask you a question in the meantime that was specifically for you, actually directed at you. Can you comment on the gaps that COVID and the use of technology is enhancing in education, for example, where children without devices, without having connectivity, having great disadvantage?
Sure, thanks for that question, and it's a great question. And actually, very recently, the World Bank and the team that I'm part of released a study that looked at the impact of COVID-19 on children with disabilities. And we looked both at what it meant in terms of their education, but also in terms of the social dimension of that. So what we found, or some of the findings that emerged from that study, was that access to assistive technologies for children with disabilities during the pandemic time was very patchy, very, very patchy. So we found that, kids were just not accessing, just did not have the access to it. So they did not have the handset, they did not have the iPad. But then we also found that even when they did, that families may not be equipped to support their children on how to use the technologies, right? So that was an issue. And so I think, and then we found that even where children had the technologies at home, the technologies themselves may not be accessible. So there were lots of issues that we picked up in relation to what this meant for children with disabilities. And I would encourage you all to have a look at our report. It's called Pivoting to Inclusion, and it sets out some of these issues that we found, both in terms of the research we did, but we ran a very large survey of about 4,000 people. So again, I think to a point that both Steve and I made in our conversation was that what I think COVID has done is to really amplify the inequalities of how people access technology. If you have access to it, then you're on this call, it's working for you. If you don't, then your situation is probably dire.
Yeah. Thank you. Steve, we have you back. Can you hear us?
I am back.
Yeah, so just going back to perhaps your points on digital exclusion, and maybe if you can make a comment particularly in relation to low-income country, which obviously is something that keeps on emerging, into what Charlotte was just talking about.
Well, again, I think unifying around needs and getting developers and researchers to create solutions, I think is critical. And I don't see enough unification. There are lots of possibilities. There are lots of organizations doing lots of great stuff. But of course, sadly, the need to compete for funding and so on and projects quite often gets in the way of developing the greatest potential solution, which might mean much more closer working, perhaps less money for each participant, but the income being a bigger win. And we need to find a way of getting round this unification challenge, the research and innovation challenge being brought together with the requirement challenge.
Yeah. Thank you, Steve. We only have a few minutes left. I'm just wondering if you could give me one thought each on the safe. There was a question about safeguarding in terms of the use of technology for vulnerable people. So what it exposes them, as good as it can be, it could also expose them just because they are vulnerable, which of course is a big question. But you can have a thought each from you on reflection on that.
Do you mean safeguarding for specifically for people with disabilities, or just more generally?
I think it's probably more general, but in this case, of course, the question was around persons with disabilities who are particularly vulnerable.
I mean, to Charlotte's point earlier, there are biometric challenges aplenty. I think there's some work to do around the protection of users, the protection. We all know that today data is king. People are trying to harvest data all the time for everything you do on the net. From the moment you click the little thing that says, I accept everything you've asked me to accept, when you accept your cookies, when you do a Google search, when you look and browse and connect on Facebook, all of that stuff is being connected. And that's before you start. That's before you begin to ask people, especially people with disabilities who perhaps have cognitive challenges and so on, when we're getting into issues around how their data is being managed and how their persona is being managed online, and we all begin to have a persona online, it's a real challenge. Again, I believe that there is a critical need for people with disabilities to be part of this big change in technology, because there are ethical and moral / data implications at every move now, and we've got to make sure that people are protected.
Thank you, Steve. Charlotte, any quick thoughts from you?
No, not really. I think Steve said it fantastically. I mean, I just think that these types of discussions are really helpful, because I think this is how we all start thinking about it, and having these types of dialogues are really very useful. So thank you very much to Leonard Cheshire for hosting this. And I see there've been a huge number of questions in the chat box that we clearly haven't gotten to all, but it's been fantastic and just amazing to be able to converse with Steve.
Well, thanks very much for playing with us, Charlotte. It's been great.
Thank you very much, everyone, for attending. We will try and respond to the questions via email follow-up. And I want to thank Charlotte and Steve for your excellent contribution. Thank you. This is a very interesting and important conversation. So we can then close. Thank you very much, everyone, and the baby. Thank you.
Cheers, guys. Bye-bye.
Bye.